Welcome, everybody, to this panel focus on agroforestry. This is part of the series that we're doing through the Climate Farmers Academy, which is dedicated to helping peer-to-peer learning between farmers all across Europe, especially those on their transition towards regenerative management. This series has covered a lot of ground already and talked to people from all over Europe and other parts of the world, hoping to share knowledge freely here so that people can accelerate their learning journeys as they aspire to regenerative management of their farms. Today, like I said, we're going to focus on many different aspects of agroforestry from experienced practitioners from different corners of Europe. Goodness knows we have some very different microclimates and climatic biomes and regions here in the continent. And so we want to give a perspective on what agroforestry can look like in the different farming contexts of this diverse continent. So let's start with these introductions. So Lorenz, why don't you tell us where you're coming in from and your relationship to agroforestry over the last few years?
Yes, thank you, Oliver. Welcome. I'm Lorenz. I'm from Germany. I'm working at Gut und Bösel. It's quite big farm in eastern Germany. We have 1,000 hectares of cropland, and since 2019 we're practicing different kinds or different forms of regenerative agriculture. And one of this is agroforestry. We have quite some experience with syntropic agroforestry. We have about, to check to not tell any crap, 24 kilometers of syntropic tree lines on about 42 hectares. We also have some alley cropping systems with poplars. And my work is mostly centered around soil health and plant health. So, but also agroforestry is a huge passion of mine. So I'm happy to share what I know and what I experience here on the farm. But I have to say all the work that was done here was done by my good friend Ranke, who's the mastermind behind all our systems. But I'm happy to share all that I know.
Thank you, Lawrence. And if anybody is interested in hearing from Renke and the systems that he developed at Gut und Bösel, you can check out the Regenerative Skills podcast. And in that process, I'll give this over then to Dmitri. Go ahead and introduce yourself, buddy, and tell us about how you work with agroforestry where you're based.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on, Oliver. So I started about 7 or 8 years ago working on Ernst Goetsche's farm as well. So kind of went straight into the syntropic agroforestry systems, and I was lucky to be on his farm in Brazil. So that was quite an introduction to agroforestry. And since then, it wasn't quite inspired by him and by others to start, like Mark Shepard as well, with some interesting agroforest systems, although I've never been there to see him. But that inspired us to start a farm in Greece with my family called Mazi Farm in an island of kind of east of Athens. And so spent 3 years over there. The farm's still running. My dad's managing it. But I spent 3 years over there, and afterwards I moved on and went to work on some different farms. Some of them you may know, like Matteo's farm in Italy. And little by little, I made my way to Portugal, where I'm settled now. In the meantime, also created the Regenerative Agroforestry podcast, which is on a pause at the moment, on a sabbatical. But definitely, we're planning to get it started again pretty soon. So let's see. So hopefully we're going to get some more interviews out. But do check it out. It's got some really interesting stuff on there. And then since I've arrived in Portugal, let's say for the past 3 years, 4 years now, I've been really focusing on the tree crop side of things. So really looking at tree crops such as olives, almonds, pistachios, which are the crops that we also work with on the farm in Greece. But I've been focusing more on the intensive side of these crops. So let's call them super intensive olives, intensive almonds. So I've been very much focusing on these systems and trying to understand how we can, make them more or implement regenerative practices within these systems and kind of influence this intensive industry for reasons that are pretty obvious. So that's what we've been doing. Agroforestry is always present and always part of our regenerative toolkit. And yeah, very happy to talk also about the experience we're having in Greece with lots of different types of systems there. On a smaller scale, we've got a 5-hectare farm there, but it's been pretty interesting. And then talk about how we're looking at agroforestry in a more large scale setting as well on these farms, which are often 1,000 hectare in size. So yeah, that's what I've got to share today.
Marvelous. Thank you, Dmitri. And he had a recent interview with Kuhn of the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture podcast, which I would highly recommend that you check out if you want to know more about his work. Now, moving lastly to Joshua Sparks. Joshua, tell us about your work and how you got involved in farming and agroforestry.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. So I'm Josh. I manage a 17-acre market garden North Devon in England. Basically, I came to the land about 5 years ago. I worked for a company called the Collective at Wolseley. So we're a collection of different businesses set up to support each other. So I grow predominantly for our pub, the Farmer's Arms, the fish shop, the shop, as a supply of that, plus with some community stuff. But when we came to the land, what I wanted to do was adopt a form of natural farming that I had studied a little bit in Japan and read about. And so I wanted a farming practice that grew in a way where it benefited an ecosystem. So we try to grow food as part of that ecosystem to protect as much biodiversity as possible. And really that evolved into agroforestry. And so we have a lot of food forests. We're trying to develop an agricultural food forest with the lessons from people like Wouter van Eck to try and prove that food forests can be agricultural systems. And we're starting to dip our toes and start to adapt forms of syntropic agriculture. I've got a couple of guys on the farm who've done courses in Europe, and we're trying to blend food forests and syntropic agriculture to match our natural farming system as much as possible.
Brilliant. So we have really different perspectives and surroundings where each of you guys are located. And maybe as part of the answer that you're going to give to the next question, tell me about what agroforestry typically looks like around you. And then the question is, where do you see the biggest opportunities or missed opportunities for integrating trees, tree crops, agroforestry in general, in the types of enterprises that you see that are common in your area? Maybe we'll go back to Lorenz.
Well, I think around my area in Eastern Germany, agroforestry is becoming more and more popular because it's so valuable for our landscape. We have quite big, like fields from our history of, the communist times, and also quite light and sandy soil. So wind erosion is usually a huge thing here in this area. But most people who use agroforestry around here are mostly focusing on, popular monocultures for energy production. So we also have a system like this, but within our work, we also have a foundation that's about researching different methods, and we have, compared those systems to our syntropic systems, and we came to very interesting findings that, basically the more diverse, the more resilient, as everybody expected. But it's nice to have it black on white. But it was quite impressive to see this difference scientifically proven. Also that basically in the syntropic system, we have a way faster carbon buildup in the soil, even in the subsoil. It's such a speed, such a rate that the scientists could not believe it in a way. And also the microbial population was extremely different than compared to the row crops in between. So that's about that. I will send the link to the study in the chat.
That would be really cool to see. Thank you. Dmitri, I see the context that you're working with very similarly in my area, the increasing intensification of 3 primary crops of this landscape that's drying out very quickly, which is olives, almonds, and to a lesser degree, pistachios, at least where I am. Tell me about what you see as the opportunities in your area, even within this context of increased intensification.
Yeah, so at the moment, as you can imagine, there's not a great deal of agroforestry going on. There's actually the opposite process going on where we've got de-agroforestry going on. So basically that's people cutting back a lot of the trees that are present on the farms as much as possible. So what I mean, when we're working with tree crops, it's kind of agroforestry is kind of like how trees can support trees, right? So it's not trees supporting, a herbaceous plant or a cereal or annual crop. It's really how trees can support trees. So it's kind of a unique interaction there because there isn't, they're both trees. So there is a bit of you need to find the right way to make them, let's say, fit in. And then when you think about intensive systems, you've got a very high density of these trees. You've got a lot of mechanization, things are done on a large scale. So you've got to also integrate the whole logistics of the farm into these systems. But one of the things that we're seeing at the moment happening a lot is a lot of the trees that are in the steeper areas or in the riparian areas, they're basically getting cut back. So they're trying to plant trees as close as possible. They're trying to basically maximize the amount of trees that you have planted per hectare. And that's obviously leads to problems, not in the short term necessarily. You don't feel the issues in the short term because, you're just you're planting more trees per hectare. I mean, the soil is pretty much the same. But what happens is that in the medium term and the long term, we're going to start to see the landscape, let's say, resilient, fall apart because we don't have basic ecological infrastructure to sustain, for example, river life in the riparian areas, so in the streams, or for example, in the steeper areas, we start to get a lot of erosion, a crazy amount of erosion, actually, in these orchards because you're passing many times with tractors, and so the landscape is just extremely exposed, often literally just bare, and life little by little struggles more and more to establish itself and sustain itself. So and at the same time, the issue is in the short term, these intensive crops, they continue to produce well because they are fed with, a lot of water and a lot of fertilizer, and they're just pumping. It's an input-based system. So it's a bit of a hard sell, agroforestry, in this context because it represents quite a significant cost. But I think this is something we can break into little by little if we get to that. But definitely the key opportunities that we're seeing here, there's a few of them. And as always, it's very much dependent on the constraints that each farm is exposed to. So many of these farms, for example, have a lot of wind issues and a lot of they're very exposed. And whilst wind is necessary in some of these systems, excessive wind does cause stress to the plant. For example, whenever there's very low temperatures, the wind can dramatically increase the frost risk. And so what you're seeing here is you have an opportunity to, for example, plant windbreaks in order to, on a kind of a wider spacing, in order to allow for some kind of climate buffer to happen. Then we've got also the riparians that are essential for landscape hydration and biodiversity. And this is, again, kind of an easy win to plant trees along these areas. And as you start to see, then you've got the steeper areas as well that I mentioned, with where currently nothing's planted, or trees have been removed, or trees have been planted. Olives and almonds have been planted when, they kind of struggle to produce. They're not extremely. Some areas on the land are just kind of either too wet or too dry or too steep, and they're just expensive to manage. And they don't, it's not, the cost benefit is just not worth investing in planting in these areas. People still do plant in them, but that should be removed and just turned into some ecological area, a small bosque or something like this. And then when you see all these different systems, then you want to connect them together, right? And then you just want to create that landscape matrix and connecting all these different systems together so that we can create some kind of a landscape where biodiversity can move within it, and where we're starting to also place trees in a smart place where they're solving issues around erosion, capturing that sediment that's coming out of the orchards, capturing that excessive fertilizer as well that's being leached out. So these are all kind of the functions that we want to see working on trees, and the opportunities to plant them are there. Unfortunately, it's not happening at the moment at scale because it's not really considered a huge priority. Pollution is kind of somebody else's problem. Biodiversity is also somebody else's problem. So at the moment, but we're working on changing that. Yeah.
It's very good to see that there's still potential there, and people are starting to see the benefits of integrating more diverse systems into these intensive orchards. Josh, your context is really interesting in that very few people have heard about integrating trees into market garden systems. Usually that's intensive horticulture on an annual basis. Tell me about how you're integrating perennials and trees into the larger farm complex and how this interacts with the diversity of the systems that you've installed.
Yeah, so in this country, our kind of agroforestry is generally a very simple system. So if you know, classic is usually apples and gooseberries, and that's regarded as agroforestry in this country. Generally, in our annual production and small market gardens, it's quite rare to see agroforestry, but that is picking up a lot of pace now, and it's getting very popular as we're recognizing that climate resilience is becoming a big factor in our food growing. You know, for us here, it's getting very unpredictable in the way that we grow annual production, especially. And the growing of annuals is becoming a riskier and riskier enterprise. It's predicted in the UK we're going to lose about 50% of our market gardens in the next year to 2 years, which is a terrifying statistic. And so what we have to do is trying to create farm resilience on the farm as much as possible, while also protecting and building biodiversity, which is the paramount to what we're trying to do here. You know, so many times is that in order to fix that first problem, usually the first thing that takes the brunt of that is the biodiversity, whether that's putting up more polytunnels, more netted protection, you know, anything that acts as a buffer to the climate and nature. And so really how we see it as a progression is that the use of perennial vegetables, again, seems to be building quite a lot of popularity. We're in the process of turning our market garden predominantly into a perennial system. And the use of the perennial vegetables in kind of balance with our agroforestry systems should add a lot of climate resilience so that we can maintain that food production. And as a business, not have to worry about those losses, which can almost be business breaking or destroying, which seems to be happening. So the next phase that we're into is really we're creating very diverse agroforestry systems. I wouldn't say we're a syntropic farm, but there's elements of, you know, kind of syntropic agriculture that we really like. And we're, like I said, we're applying that with our food forest mentality as well. And we're kind of going the line of very diverse, dense plantings of linear food forests, you know, borrowing a lot of ideas from tropic agriculture. And as we put more of that agroforestry on the farm, we're using that space to also start to plant perennial vegetables en masse. And so we're just in the process of putting a nut forest on the farm. So chestnuts, walnuts, cobs in very dense planting pockets. And then we're going to use that as a space to grow cooked perennial greens, Korean asters, Korean celeries, good King Henrys, and everything like that, and start to create very dense, close agroforestry systems with perennial vegetables, hopefully to prove that perennial vegetables are an alternative to, like I said, putting up loads of annual protection systems that we don't want to do, because again, it impacts our biodiversity quite hard. But like I said, perennial veg and agroforestry is really picking up steam in the UK, and it's kind of coming out of necessity for us. Because like I said, it's just getting harder and harder to become a business and maintain a business and grow that food at the same time.
Yeah, so a lot of what we've talked about so far is all coming back to longer term resilience. And yet there's still the uphill battle of the initial investment and the time that it takes for these longer term maturation crops to start to give the benefits that you're hoping to receive. Before we move on, Josh, how do you talk to somebody about incorporating this into a business model when oftentimes cash flow is already a problem in farms and the turnover is required just to continue the bankroll, whereas some of these are going to take multiple seasons or even closer to a decade to start to see a return on? How do you square that from the business end?
Yeah, so, you know, I kind of joked that we did everything backwards, unfortunately. We're now putting in more windbreaks because we realized wind is a problem for us here, living in a very high up, windy part of the UK. We've only just put our nursery in now, which we should have done in the beginning. And so what we generally say now is, you know, at least put that small nursery in. I try to really push the message of try and make yourself as self-reliable in plant production as much as possible. A lot of our agroforestry, we specifically use trees and shrubs and those crops that can be propagated through cuttings or easily germinate, and we can easily do it by seed. We try, when possible, to keep a lot of kind of complicated propagation out of it because we just don't have the facilities to do that. And so we're trying to build a system where you can propagate it in-house yourself. A lot of our agroforestry now is 90% cuttings and direct seeding. We've stepped a lot away from buying in trees and buying in bare roots and whips as much as possible to prove that point to people that you don't need that money. And also for us as a business, we want to cut our costs a lot as well. And the way that Birch Farm grows is we treat everything like one ginormous polyculture, agroforestry, vegetable production, everything. And so what we're doing is, because we have very diverse vegetable polycultures, we try to get 5 different kind of genus or plant families in one bed at one time. And what makes Bart's Firm unique is we don't actually weed that much. We've created a farming system where we grow our crops in balance with weeds, recognizing that those weeds are key to soil fertility and biodiversity. But those polycultures open up opportunities that, while it takes 3 years for our perennials to bulk up, we can use those pockets and times while there's gaps, and we can still grow our annual production in amongst those perennials. And what we're starting to do is grow our perennials. It takes 2 to 3 years for our perennials to fill that position, but that's still 2 to 3 years that we can already start to grow annuals in amongst that until we can phase them out. And like any market garden, salad production is our big cash flow here. So salad is how we generate a lot of our income. And we're finding that actually perennial salads, where we can pick in 1 year, 2 years at the tops. And so already off the bat, we can do a lot of perennial salad mixes. And actually all our perennials this year all our salads will be perennial based this year. And we're taking a big step back from annual production. And so we use a lot of things like Morris alba, Tilia cordata. They become our lettuce replacements. And we're starting to really delve into that kind of tree leaf edible elements as well. And then we have other perennials that we supplement that with. So actually from the salad point of view, we can actually generate a really good impact, pretty quickly. And so that's kind of how we do it. So we're phasing it, which is important. Something I learned from the farm by doing this is that if you do it all at once, it kind of bites you in the arse a little bit. And so we take a mentality of slowly phasing that and allowing it to like gently kind of ease in until you build up those numbers, really.
Fantastic. Really cool example to watch continue to grow here. Dmitri, you are in an area that's profitability and cash flow is kind of everything in these intensive business models. And you already talked about the difficulty of making the financial case to invest in more diversity and putting in trees within these systems. Where do you see the way of convincing that this can start to pay off and maybe even accelerate that lag period that it takes for them to see a return when integrating them into the systems you talked about earlier?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I was just thinking about the Morris alba salads. It's just sticking in my mind. I really want to eat some of these salads. Josh, you need to get some of these salads over to us here in Portugal. I guess we can take them ourselves. Actually, we've got these trees here. I need to find a way to eat a perennial salad. Love it.
I mean, people laughed when we did it and we proposed the idea, and people were like, that's absolutely nonsense. What are you talking about? And actually, what we proved was our perennial salads were more delicious than the annual salads, more nutritious, more mineral. And now actually people can't get enough of the perennial salads. Sorry, not to butt in, but that point is that actually we can sell these things at a high yield to chefs because they're now we basically got them hooked on it and they're so desperate to get more and more of it. But yeah, no, definitely perennial salads are delicious.
Love it. Okay, so yeah, going back to our context, there's 2 things. Firstly, how are we going to scale out these systems? Well, that's secondly. And the first thing is how are we going to convince these large producers and growers to invest in agroforestry? And that's kind of 2 separate, that needs to be 2 separate answers there, of course. But the first part about convincing, well, the negative side of it is that it's managed by investors that are looking a lot at the bottom line. But the positive side is that often these large investment funds, they have to meet, or they are under increasing pressure to meet sustainability objectives. They are under increasing pressure to report on what they're doing around carbon, etc. And one of the huge things, or very positive things of agroforestry, is the amount of carbon we can store in these systems. So there's different ways that I think most of us are familiar here as to how we can sell this, how we can kind of convince them. But it's very much around, do the right thing. It's not necessarily, not often the case is it going to be this can directly benefit your economics, because establish a hedge. It'll take 10 years to really start for the biodiversity to really kick in and for it to produce a lot of ecological benefits. Whereas, for example, planting a diverse cover crop, it's from year 1. So when we're coming in and we're consulting these people about, doing regenerative agriculture, the first thing we tell them to do is not necessarily plant a tree. It's more about let's kickstart biodiversity through, separating some areas, reducing on herbicide sprays, not cleaning everything, letting things run a bit more wild, planting a cover crop with a mixed species, hopefully 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 species. So that's kind of how we're approaching this kind of direct benefits of 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 biodiversity and ecology to these farms. But then telling them, like there's no economic benefit for them to prevent nutrient runoff. That's more about, them feeling like they need to do the right thing. And a lot of them do feel like they want to do the right thing, and that's when we come in. And so again, there's mechanisms. We need to be working more on biodiversity credits and carbon credits for these farmers to convince them. That's clearly going to be something that helps a lot. Also, governments, not in Portugal, or not a lot in Portugal, but in France, for example, the governments are funding a lot of agroforestry systems, are paying for everything, including the farmer's time. So these are the kind of things that are going to be, because these things are, of course, the farmers need to farm, and these funds, etc. They need to be profitable, but in a sense, they are responsible. What I meant is that they're responsible for what they for being sustainable, but also the investment that they need to put in to regenerate to regenerate this ecosystem is not necessarily all of their responsibility. This is years and years and years of us cutting things back and removing trees. So it's not necessarily all their responsibility, and also it's going to benefit a variety of people. It's going to benefit society. It's a public good, as we say in economics. And so the government help, carbon credits, all these things, there are mechanisms they're gonna help them to do that. And the other one is pressure. Under pressure from, they need to do the right thing. There's rules, regulations that are evolving that sometimes not evolving, but this is the kind of stuff that puts them under pressure. So once they're feeling that pressure and they're seeing that opportunity, which comes more from let's say a communication standpoint or a business resilience standpoint, from a regulation perspective, all these things, or from them being like, we want to do the right thing, and the investors are actually have sustainability objectives. Okay, once they've got that, then we need to think how we're going to do it at scale, and how we're going to actually, and this is where Josh was making some really good points here, saying, you don't come in and plant a whole agroforestry system on 500 hectares, not even 200 hectares, not even 100 hectares at once. And then you need to have the systems in place to be able to be efficient. Josh was saying, like, now we don't, buy trees. We are working with cuttings and working with seeds. Well, each context has its own planting, kind of its own trees, its own planting techniques and methods that will make it much more cost efficient to do so. And so then we need to have teams, and this is where there's opportunities, business opportunities for companies to set up and be like, okay, well, we're experts in agroforestry planting at scale. We're using forestry machinery, so we can, do this at scale. We've got solid weed management techniques so that we can establish the trees with a lower risk, because the problem is always planting trees and them dying. How many projects have I seen where we've planted lots of trees and they just haven't, they haven't held up? So all these things, there's all these little technical details that we need to refine to keep the price down and make sure we can do things at a every time larger and larger scale, and this obviously needs to be very adapted to the pedoclimatic context. And then we have something that's valuable for the funds. A lot of funds would love to do this, but don't know how to do it in a way that is efficient and low risk. So it's also, if we come up to them with a solution as how to do that, they're much more likely to be able to say, okay, I can connect the different things here. I've got the carbon credits coming in. I've got my investors on board because I've convinced them around the sustainability and the risk thing. I've got I want to benefit my local community as well. That's every time the local community is putting more and more pressure on these super intensive systems. They don't want them close to their houses. They're frustrated with them. There's political pressure going on. So there's opportunities for them here, and they're starting to see that. And some of them have very well have seen that very well. And so then we, and little by little, we start to create that change. But that change takes a long time. And obviously, as you'll know, this is a kind of processes that last 5 to 10 years. So little by little.
Yeah, and that's just going to be part of it in any scenario. These are longer mature systems. There are, as you've both outlined already, lots of ways to cut down the risk in getting to points of maturity and seeing the different benefits that can bring. But I really like what you mentioned there, and this is something that we've definitely found and can echo from the climate farmers' perspective, is that it should not be all on the farmers themselves. They are often working under pressures that are entirely external and being asked to pull so much more than their own weight in the way that they work, and also carry the benefits and the ecological services that we all benefit from on top of the pressures that they're already under. And so this should be a common good that we collectively invest in. I completely agree with that. Now, Lorenz, I know that the farm that you're working with at Guttenbusel has had an outside influence on what is happening in agroforestry in your area and even further outside because of an incredible investment in research and in monitoring and in R&D that you guys have done over quite a few years now. Can you give us a perspective on some of the more interesting findings? Because you told us some stuff at the beginning that is quite intuitive. You know, you put more diversity into the system, you get better results in resilience and in soil biodiversity. But what are some of the things that have been really shocking or inspiring to you from the R&D that you guys have done on the farm?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think, yeah, we have quite a unique farm setting because we have this foundation that is, yeah, basically making our farm into real life lab kind of. And so we have the opportunity to try a lot of different things and, yeah, grow very fast in terms of experience with less risk than like commercial operation. So at the same time, we are a commercial operation in our farming context, but not in the agroforestry yet. But I think the biggest findings were, first of all, that in those diverse systems, we went pretty fast from buying the trees from a tree nursery to going almost completely to direct seeding and cuttings, like Josh is also doing, because we were experiencing here in our very dry climate, we have around 400 to 500 millimeters of precipitation a year on average, and sandy soil, so it's quite dry. And in a low input system like we want to implement, we have no chance to water our 42 kilometers. So we want a very low input resilient system. And by planting mostly trees by seed, we were seeing that we could achieve resilience and plant health that we were not achieving by any means from like trees from the tree nursery. We also started our own tree nursery in the second year, where we took very good care or focused a lot on good root development, planting our trees in root pouches or root trainers, and they are also performing very well. Also making our own substrate for them, and produce some very nice compost for the tree nursery. And this was the biggest game changer. So we have now like failures or of less than 3%. So almost all trees survive. And this is quite rare for this area where other people have higher losses. And I think the study that I already mentioned was giving the like way more insights to the soil microbial aspect. So just observing that or being able to show that in our syntropic systems we have less pathogens in the soil, in the tree rows than in the cropland beside of it. First of all, then also the faster carbon buildup, the potential of building stable humus is just immense in those systems. Also, the biodiversity is way higher. So there's many benefits from those systems that we could show, and that might lead this kind of agroforestry into a more adaptable or more widespread application, because it's just so efficient in producing very fast to help to build very good soil formation and increase biodiversity. But I think one of our most interesting fields is our forest transitioning project, where we were transitioning pine monoculture plot into a diverse forest, a mixed forest. And there we had like the worst conditions you can imagine. Very, very sandy soil, like literally beach sand. The pines were having a very bad influence on the soil pH. It was around 3. And like aluminium available, not a lot. We made a lot of soil tests as well. No accessible nutrients basically. We did not lime the soil or did anything. We just did a clear cut on one part and left some trees in another part and planted a very diverse mixture by direct seeding, but also some trees from the tree nursery, from our tree nursery. And it was insane to see how fast actually the plants were growing in the clear-cut plot. And we also had the university here to research this, and they were even finding that the more shade-loving trees were doing better in the clear-cut part than where there were some old trees left over, and the growth was like just literally 3 times higher in the clear-cut part. So we were wondering what's going on there, and the only reason we can explain it or the only way we can explain it is that by clear cutting, we were actually like rebooting all the mycorrhizal connections in the soil, and they were basically providing everything that the plants needed, even though it was not visible on the soil tests. The microbiology made everything accessible what the plants needed. And because I forgot to mention that the part where we had the traffic parts in the forest where the big machines were running, even in the clear cut spot, we also subsoiled this area. We planted this diverse mix in it, and nothing grew. Everything died, even though the compaction was gone, but the microbial population was also gone from the compaction. So it was clearly visible that the mycorrhiza did all the work in sustaining the plants to grow this healthy. So yeah, this is our most impressive finding, I would say.
Well, that is fascinating. That I had not heard that before. I would love to learn more about what you guys found in this. And I'm really glad too that you mentioned forestry in general, because it's often the part that's left out of agroforestry, but timber is absolutely an agricultural product if you lump it into the broader definition. And many farmers that we speak to, at least, have portions of their farm that are left in forestry and bosque, and something that they either manage actively or they don't. And seeing this as a potential for an extra income or ecological benefits, or even buffering of some of the ecological extremes that we're experiencing, I think there's a lot of potential in that. And seeing that you guys have done some trials and seen some really positive results in reconfiguring the health of your forest could offer opportunities for other farmers as well. Dmitri, same question to you. Going into the opportunities that you had mentioned before, what are some of the challenges that you have faced establishing these more diverse agroforestry systems, and how did you overcome those? What are some of the ways that you have increased the success rates of adding the diversity that you've talked about before?
So we'll have to shift over to Greece now, in terms of where we planted much more diverse systems there. And I think that one of the key things that we found, which is very logical, is just irrigation, being able to irrigate at a larger scale. So being able to, when the trees are planted, quickly after that, install an irrigation pipe and be able to. And okay, we're in Greece, right? So this is a very specific climate, and we're in Greece. We are on a hill as well. We're not in a valley bottom where there may be some chances of a tree surviving there. And we're in a very degraded context as well, very exposed to wind. Wind's actually carrying a lot of chlorine and sodium because it's in an island. So, it's got all these it's very, very difficult context. And so it's very important to be able to establish them well. And again, this is maybe obvious for some, maybe less for others, but you really need to invest quite heavily at the start. You save a lot of money by making sure you prepare the soil well, making sure that you applied an amendment, compost, provided some support on a chemical and biological basis for the plant, for the tree. And yeah, I love Lorenz's stories around also the having root trained trees that have deeper roots. We weren't able to really test the difference between trees that we bought from nurseries that didn't have these systems and trees that did. But I really trust the logic is there, and I've heard this in other instances, so I really trust that that's important. The problem is, going back to what Josh was saying, like doing it yourself is important in this case in terms of the nursery, because it's hard to find trees that are properly root trained. There are some, of course, and especially in regions where they have more of a forestry culture. But in our regions, there's not much of a forestry culture because it's not really worth producing timber in southern Greece. It's you plant tree crops for nuts, but not for wood. So yeah, these are the key aspects, I would say. And this is linked to the syntropic stuff, because when we planted in Greece, we obviously planted many different species together. And what happens is that you can plant, for example, a small oak tree on its own, and you can plant a line of them. They may do okay. But if you plant a hedge and you plant many different species together, and the faster growing species that are more resilient on the northern side, where they don't create so much light issues, unless you're managing it regularly, of course, but they're on the northern side, and also where the wind's coming from and the cold is coming from, then you're really going to shelter the slower growing plants, and you're going to get faster growth rates. So we saw our land just transform by creating a shelter belt with a species called Myoporum hispanicum, which is a species from New Zealand, incredible species. It's like fire resistant, kind of succulent leaf, very fast growing with water, stops growing without water, but it just doesn't die, it stagnates. It's really, really impressive. They planted also a lot in Portugal, and that's the kind of hedge species, it also tolerates pruning very well. And yeah, that's the kind of species, it's very resistant to salty winds and burning and it doesn't burn as well. We try to put it on fire and it just struggles to burn. So it's just such a useful multifunctional species, and I think there's also something to say around choosing the right species and knowing your species well. So again, and this takes time, and it's really important to be talking with people that are implementing agroforestry systems or smart diversified forestry systems. But these details do matter in terms of the pots, for example, but just the species. People that have experience with tried different species have been able to say that these are the ones that are good for these kind of in these contexts, or that provide these functions. There's a lot of knowledge that's necessary to be able to design them well from the start and plant the right tree in the right place. So that's really important to take into account as well.
Nice. There's a lot of really good advice there, and it squares both with what Lorenz was saying and what we're kind of doing out here. Our team is helping these replanting projects to figure out their hydrology first, because water is such a limiting factor, especially to growth in the longer term. You might be able to keep a plant alive for a little while, but if you've got compacted soil, if there's a lack of moisture, they might stagnate or go into senescence really easily. And also some sort of form of amendment to help the soil along in its succession to be able to help and to produce higher level succession plants. It's like, putting in something that needs a lot of requirements straight into desert sand, similar to what Lorenz was talking about, but different conditions a little bit. We've also seen really good results with that. Now, Josh, I know that water is not your limiting factor, but there have been a lot of other things that were barriers, were roadblocks when you guys got started. I know your soil conditions were really tough. Tell us about what you have found that helps to increase the success rate in the different plantings that you've done.
Yeah, so we are the complete opposite. Rain and water is probably our nemesis here as much as possible. So I can't really speak from an experience of drought, definitely not. When we took over the site, we were a dairy pasture. So the part of Devon we are in is very intensive dairy agriculture. And so predominantly that is a lot of slurry, a lot of silage cutting. They can cut up to 10 to 12 times a year if the weather's right. And so what we're finding when we took the farm over, the soils were really heavily compacted due to constant tractor applications of slurry. A lot of the fields aren't really for silage production. It's basically because they have so many animals inside, they produce so much slurry, they have to get it out. And so where a lot of land acquisition around here is actually dairy farms just buying more and more land so they can spray more and more slurry because it just keeps building up and up. So we were really heavily compacted. It was a heavy monoculture for decades, basically just ryegrass. Hedgerows here are cut down to basically very, very short. So in the UK, we have this whole hedgerow kind of connection in our countryside. It's kind of, it's a form of agroforestry, but especially in this part of Devon, they cut it right down to the ground. So you don't get any nesting birds in there really because it's too short. And if they are nesting, they'll generally get splayed with slurry every couple of weeks. So we don't get a lot of biodiversity in our hedgerow. And so when we started to establish a lot of our agroforestry, what Lorenz was saying was really interesting because we are having problems with that, why things weren't established. Now we've heard that kind of makes sense now through that compaction. And so we really struggled to get things going in the first couple of years. We tried cover crops in the first year to build that soil fertility up and try to build fertility through root diversity as much as possible, which is a philosophy on the farm. We do make our own inoculants on the farm. We do make things like IMOs and different soil solutions. We use a lot of lactobacillus on the farm. It's one of our chief inoculants that we make in-house. And so that seemed to help gradually by the application of soil inoculants, and lactobacillus started to break up that compaction. But really how we overcame that was after we planted our main crop trees, we just filled the space with so many different pioneer species. We crammed them in. I wish I planted more. For us, ulmus, birch and poplar work really well for us here in our climate. And then you could really see that obviously that carbon sequestration was happening. Soil fertility was increasing massively each time. Wind is also a killing factor for us. So we can have up to like 87-mile-an-hour winds here. We're only about a mile from the beach. So we also get those saline winds coming in all the time. And they acted as good nursery stock while those trees established. And we found that by chucking pure diversity into the system and filling it up as much as possible with the intention of felling and thinning as it came a problem to other main crop trees, that really increased the diversity. And that's why really all of our agroforestry, we try to plant as close as possible, as diverse as possible, because that's the way that we found we can overcome so many problems that the farm has. But now with our agroforestry 5 years in, the soil structure and fertility is just increasing massively. That it's just getting easier and easier now for us to establish systems.
Yeah, I really like that example as well. And it gives a difference in perspective from what we were talking about earlier, but a lot of similar patterns that can be used and extrapolated into adaptation for wherever anybody is putting this into practice. I think that's a good time now to go into the Q&A session. There are a couple of questions here in the chat, but I'm also going to give priority for people who would like to answer their own questions. So probably the best way to manage this would be to, if you would like to answer or ask your question, go down to the React button on the bottom bar of your screen. It's a little heart with an arrow on the side, and you can raise your hand there. And I will call on people as they've got questions. If it takes a little while, I'll start in the chat. All right, first one from the chat here. We've got, have you been following the research, Josh, from the Land Institute with their development of perennial grain crops? Do you have other sources of perennial production? You talk about some of the things that you've integrated with your perennial crops and if grain is one of those considerations?
So grain is something I'd love to introduce on the farm, from an edible point of view and a milling point of view. But actually, we try to produce a lot of annual grain because we use so much in our fermented composting. So we don't make aerobic compost here. We do bokashi compost. So carbohydrates are really important for that fermentation phase for us. I would love to introduce rows of perennial grains within our agricultural food forest. So we have a 10-acre agricultural food forest, which is set to have those perennial grains. The problem I found in the UK is that it's really hard to access those seeds, basically, or stock. I worked with perennial grains in America, where there's a big perennial grain movement. When I came back to the UK, I just found it nearly impossible to find a source to collect those seeds to do that. So I'd love to do it, but I'm trying to find a source that we can actually start to grow it. That's the problem I have. And that actually leads on to another question. Another answer, in the fact that what we're finding is as we're pushing those perennial foods, which is why the nursery is so important, is that actually accessibility to a lot of these plants is really hard in our country. We have a couple of really good nurseries like Incredible Vegetables. Martin Crawford has a really good nursery for perennial foods, but actually the accessibility to these plants is really, really difficult to get it going. So it's taking a long time to source a lot of these plants to actually start growing them and propagating them. But perennial wise, what we're aiming for is, like our cooked greens, we're going for Korean celery, Korean aster, we're going for cabbage thistle. Root crops, we're going for things like Jerusalem artichoke, skirret, Chinese yam. Mashua is a really good crop for us. We managed to get 60 kilos of mashua root from 10 plants, highly productive plant. We can also pick the salads and edible flowers in the summer. We work with the chefs and they'll develop that. And our perennial salads are made up with things like white mulberry, tilia, mitsuba, perennial rockets, herbs, and all these different perennials that we're introducing to the farm now. And obviously things like Good King Henry is a really good one for us that we love. Patience Doc is another good one. So the other things we're trying to access, but like I said, we're struggling to find the stock in order to grow it because there's just not that much accessibility currently.
Have either of the other two of you been working with perennial grains or perennial vegetables in any of your systems yet?
No, can't say I have.
Well, we worked with some not perennial grain, but biannual rye that was producing two years in a row. That's quite interesting. But yeah, the problem is to find a market for this. That's usually the biggest issue.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if it starts to catch on more here in Europe the way it has in the United States. Now, the next question here is, in choosing the right species, is it directed to you, Dmitri? What were the considerations for choosing a non-native species? Obviously, in Portugal, eucalypts have proved to be a problem, and there's a lot of other examples of non-native species that have become either invasive or massive ecological problems. How do you feel about that?
I'm not an ecologist, and I would be careful to introduce species that aren't present in the region already. But as I replied in the comment here, the case of eucalyptus, for example, it's planted so much because it's just such an incredible species, really. It just grows so fast in such shitty conditions, and so it's a great opportunity if used in the right way. And of course, the issue with eucalyptus in Portugal which is a major issue, is the scale of the plantations, the intensity of the plantations, the very short cycle of rotations, the density. So we're doing, super intensive eucalyptus basically, and it's extremely flammable. But if you take that species and you plant it in a different system, if you think about it in a windbreak, as you see it often in Portugal, not extremely often, but sometimes, you'll very quickly reduce your wind issue. And that can help you to kickstart your agricultural production on the what would you call it, on the wind protected side, and it'll help you it'll help to get you going, and it doesn't represent a huge fire risk in that case because you don't have that density of plantations. Of course, a hedge can catch fire, but it won't burn the whole region because you don't have just hundreds of hectares planted to the same species with the same height and etc. So I think that they're important tools that we use. We've planted them, for example, in Greece, eucalyptuses, and they produce a lot of the biomass that we now use to mulch our fruit trees. And we just got some of the analyses in now where we've been applying mulch on our fruit trees for, I think it's about 5 years now. We've become self-sufficient in mulch on the farm since the third year. Before we had to use prunings that we were using olive prunings from other farmers that would otherwise burn them. And yeah, so we've used it, we are using it, and we've seen in the soil analyses that we've increased by 1.5 to 2 percentage points our organic matter as compared to our interlines, which we obviously, the interlines, they've got a cover crop system. We have a grazing system as well, infrequent, but the organic matter is increasing there, but it's just increased dramatically faster thanks to the eucalyptuses and the mulch that they provide. They're not the only species. We've got other species there, but it's quite interesting that the farm has become basically self-sufficient on biomass now. I see something here. I see Juan saying on the comments, I think it's worth bringing it up, saying eucalyptus is not the best option. It demands a lot of water. In the Canary Islands, it's a big problem in a land with scarcity of water. And yeah, it's of course, to produce that amount of biomass, you need to have a lot of evapotranspiration, and it does use a lot of water. And what you need to make sure you do with the eucalyptus, if you are planting it in close proximity to fruit trees, is firstly, I believe, and this may be contrary to some of the people in Syntropic, and happy to have a debate on that, but I would be on this, try to plant not such high density of them. So we're little by little thinning them out of the farm. And the other important thing is to make sure that they do not have a large canopy. So you want to be pollarding them basically on an annual or biannual basis, because if you leave that canopy very large, you've got the fire risk that's as large, and also you've just got a lot of it's just starting to dominate. So you want to control it and cut down the canopy. Less leaves means less evapotranspiration and less water use, and you can also prune it at strategic moments. But that's extremely important to manage it. It needs, including eucalyptus in a forestry setting is quite unmanaged apart from the harvest. But in a setting where you've got fruits and nut trees, this is a managed, intensively managed system. Usually it is, and that's when you can start to kind of overcome some of the challenges that eucalyptus brings.
Really like those insights there. Lorenz and Josh, I'd invite you to both weigh in on how you use, let's say, non-native. I know there's a whole controversy just in that terminology right there, but let's say things that are not common to where you are planting them. How have those been integrated into your system, and what advice would you give on their use?
Yeah, I really love that topic because it's very difficult for many people to wrap their head around that we are planting like North American species that are supposedly invasive here on our farm. But to be honest, they are actually more adapted to our climate nowadays because they are way more resilient in terms of drought stress, for example. And most of them are actually pioneer trees. So they are basically just preparing the conditions for the native trees that will be basically the main crops in the future. And at some point, they will just be shaded out and the conditions are not favorable to them anymore. So they won't become an issue. But this said, it's very important to realize that this is a very intensively managed system. Where we prune regularly, so we don't produce any seeds that get spread in this environment. But in this well managed system, I think invasive trees are a huge opportunity because they produce so much biomass and help soil formation immensely.
I very much agree with that. We have similar context here. The one that we're managing right now is black locust. That's the one that is like the invasive that in some places they're trying to get rid of, but has so many benefits if properly managed. Josh, what have you got, bud?
Yeah, so I don't know. I kind of think the whole term native and non-native is relevant now in our current ecosystem because there's so much non-native and native in Britain, especially growing everywhere around us. This idea of like pure native doesn't really exist, especially in urban areas, even more so because there's just so much from outside that we bring in. I think from an agroforestry point of view, we have to look at the science and we have to look how our climate is changing. And some of these trees that we're investing in agroforestry, maybe in 50 to 100 years, may not be able to cope with that climate change anymore. We've missed that opportunity, to do that. Now, people like Ben Law, who's a forester in the country, he's actually planting new forests by actually putting in 25% non-native trees and looking more at North America and the south of France, where the direction that our climate is going, those trees will have a far greater survival rate in this country. And he's doing the same with new forest plantings because, again, in 100 years, our growing site will be completely different if this climate persists in the same way. And for me, myself, I'm a farmer, I'm a grower. And so from a business point of view as well, and, I don't like to put a monetary thing on it, is that we have to find the trees that help the system the best way and can yield the most, for example. So yield is a really important thing for us as well. And as was said previously, like these are very intensive managed systems. It's not as if they're going to kind of like run rampant and run wild and disappear. We're constantly managing them, maintaining them, watching that. We don't really have the invasive problem, I guess, in the sense that, especially from a food growing point of view, we don't really have a problem with those invasives as much, like in the Mediterranean and so on. But I think that, My take on food forests, for example, is that food forests are one of the oldest agricultural systems we have as a species. We know that us as a race or a species, we've been cultivating forests for food production for thousands and thousands of years. And part of that cultivation and production of food forests was finding the things that grew well and implementing into systems to create a system that feeds us. And I think that's just as important. We have to create a system that's going to feed us as well as a species. And sometimes we have to look further afield to bring those trees in or bring those shrubs in or plants in that can feed us as a society and encourage more of this growth. So I kind of say my point.
I like that, especially because we've been doing that for every other type of cultivation all around the world since we started to move across continents. I mean, let's talk about how many areas in Europe are covered with corn. That's not from here. Is that invasive? Anyway, before going down that rabbit hole, I want to give it over to Iref. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been like a super interesting conversation. I've learned a lot. And I have a sort of two-part question because especially for Lorenz, like the work that has been done there with studying the effect of the microbial activity, what you mentioned before, do you mean just like the mycorrhizal colonization, or are there like biological assessments being done also like in the soil to sort of test like differences in the growth? And connected to that, is less informed about this, but I recently heard someone mention that in growing new food forests, people typically have this idea that, after 3 or 4 years, 40% of the trees might die. And it's like sort of accepted that this will be the way. And what I heard is that when people start paying attention to the microbial activity so that you have like a balanced ecosystem in the soil, this is not the case. And then food forests become more resilient. And I'm wondering if any of you have experience also like within agroforestry context, and is, all this story with the roots, if it has something to do there, or any comments really?
Yes, regarding the soil microbial composition, the study was not only looking for mycorrhizal connections, it was assessing the whole microbial profile, and there was a higher population of bacteria, of protozoa, of fungi, of all sorts, and archaea. So it was looking at all levels, and this makes so much sense for me that just this diverse planting, increased photosynthesis, and also biomass mulch on the soil just feeds more diverse population of microorganisms than just a monoculture on bare soil. So this is huge. Also what it adds in terms of resilience, like you were saying. I don't know how they planted those trees if 40% die after 3 years. But we have very, very bad conditions here, especially there in the forest. But what we saw is that basically, providing some microbiology, like adding some nice compost extract in the tree lines after planting, or dipping the roots in microbial solution from native microbes, and also bringing seeds into the soil had a huge impact. For example, some of our seeded trees are now as big as the trees from the tree nursery that came like 1.50 meters high when we bought them, but they were just doing very miserable in this low input context when they came from a conventional tree nursery where they got fed a lot of fertilizer and water. And now so people argue that they cannot afford to plant trees by seed because they have to wait too long. But in this context, now we have a more resilient tree that is the same height as the bought tree from the tree nursery, and all the trees that we bought from the tree nursery in this low input system, they got like a lot of diseases like rusts, or like, I don't know this in English, but all the seeds that were just beside of it, no issue at all. So growing by seed is our biggest life hack to get resilient trees. This is what we're now implementing. We're also on a bigger scale. Now this year, we're going to plant 40 more hectares of agroforestry. And in the coming 2 years, we want to plant more than 200 hectares. And this is not possible to do it the full syntropic way because it's too much manual labor. But we are using now like a lot of syntropy inspired methods. For example, growing by seed, a diverse mix, but more like a Mark Shepard style but by seed. So we can get this in big scale, still be resilient, but not have as much labor.
Nice. I think maybe that could be one of the things that we explore before wrapping up here. This has kind of been the hero in the background of our conversation for people who are getting started in here is the idea of getting access to seed or starting your own nursery. This has been mentioned a few times now. And considering that I'm also in my second year of plant nursery and just starting to scale things up, I would love to hear from you guys who are doing it as well. What are the advantages? How can people get started? Where can you source material from if you're just getting going? Does anybody want to describe or get us started with their nursery operation? Maybe Josh?
Yeah. So I think we have the ultimate definition of a bodge nursery. So all the materials we've used to build it have come from people or skips or what we found locally. It's basically pallets. It's made from pallets. And so what we have created is mice was a big pressure for us. And I've spent a career killing mice and moles. And when I came to the farm as part of that natural farming model, I didn't want to do it again. So I'm not doing it. I don't want to hurt them. It's not their fault. And so what we've done is we've created an outside area. We've hung a pallet table on wires hanging off support. So the table floats, almost looks like a hammock. And we're finding that actually the mice don't get up there. They can't climb up it. They can't access it. So all our tree seeds that require cold stratification go outside on this hanging pallet bench. And we get really good germination from that. We've built a raised bed beside that for cuttings. And I've gone to local construction places and we had some left over and I've actually brought loads of sharp sand. So I was very fortunate to work with a grower called Peter Korn who grew everything in sharp sand. He didn't use soil compost. And so our cuttings bed is made up of sand and we're going to add biochar to that we make on site. And we simply pop the cuttings into the sand, biochar mix, and we let them grow on for a year. We have another raised bed for ridging. So we put things like aronias, Chanomalies, the Nursery caerulea, the honeyberries. We ridge them and layer them and then split them every 2 years. And then we have another sand bed for growing on cuttings. And that's pretty much our nursery. And that can roughly turn around about 1,000 cuttings at one time and a few thousand tree seeds. And it's the size of, I think our nursery is 12 meters wide by 14 meters long. And we can produce about 1,000 cuttings and a couple of thousand seeds from that as well. When we get to the next stage, we go to field scale and we plant them in the field to grow on. And then we live from there and move or in situ, basically. And that's kind of our little nursery. We made it for nothing really, cost pennies in comparison. And we can still produce loads. And we're pretty much fundamentally independent now in plant production and nursery stock for ourselves now. So we can produce all our agroforestry pretty much in the house if we want to.
Very cool. One thing I would love to know is where you're sourcing the original material from, because that's one of the difficulties that I've had.
Yeah, so things like the sharp sand we just get from construction projects. Builders in that pile up the sand. They don't want it. We have a construction project as part of our own project. So we just basically take it. We actually have a rubble garden on the farm built from 360 tons of rubble that I met a bloke in the pub and he wanted to sell it to me for basically £11 a ton. So we bought 360 tons of it and built a garden from that. There's a big thing in the UK, especially in horticulture, about trying to find ways to reuse materials such as sand and rubble and crushed concrete and use that in horticultural growing. And so that's been a big inspiration. And so basically we've just managed to source it locally from people who didn't want it. They're happy for us to take it away for them because they don't have to pay to remove it or dump it. Like I said, pallets we just get for free because people just want to get rid of them. And then, and that's how we built it. Or we had to buy some shuttering to build the raised beds. And we bought some battens to create the shade houses because they were in shade houses. And then for the shade houses, what we do is we grow grapevines up them, and the grapevines produce the shade for us during the summer. And then we just bring them back in the winter when we want more light levels to come in.
That's really cool, but I was kind of more referring to the plant material. So I don't know. So like where you are, maybe it's easy to find this kind of stuff, but I have been really struggling to source tree seeds or cuttings of more unusual, like, you know, honeyberry, like you're talking about. I can't find that here in my life.
So we are quite lucky in the sense that Martin Crawford, I guess everyone knows about Martin Crawford. He has the oldest food forest in the UK now. One of the oldest forests. There is one in Scotland as well. His is 31 years old. And, you know, I should say now that food forest is under risk. So there's a big campaign to try and save it. So I highly recommend everyone, you know, sign a petition to save that because we need it, because it's really teaching us a lot about climate resilience and food forests. But anyway, Martin Crawford has a really good food forest nursery from that food forest where he basically sells the most obscure varieties that you can't really get anywhere else. So we are lucky to have people like Martin Crawford that we can get that from, buy stock and propagate them from. I guess is Etsy a worldwide thing? Yeah, I guess it is. I actually find Etsy is a really good place to sort plant seeds because you find the really crazy collectors that want to sell that seed. So if you're looking for really obscure things, Etsy is pretty good. But yeah, we're very lucky to have Martin Crawford and his nursery because he grows such a wide diversity of plants and different varieties for farming, bigger berries, sweeter tasting. So I guess we're lucky for that.
Thank you for sharing that advice. Lorenz, how have you guys been setting up your nursery?
Well, we also made a lot of raised beds with root air pruners, basically. Also, we use root pouches, like it's like a material where the roots won't circle in the pot and makes a very dense and branched root system. And we get our planting material mostly from local, like mixed cultured orchards. I don't know. Yeah, very diverse. We have a big culture here in this area of people growing their own food since a long time, and there's a big diversity in old like apple, pear, plum varieties. So a lot of nerds collecting those. So we're well connected to them, and also all the trees that we use for biomass, we basically collect ourselves here in this area. We also find that this is a very good way to get also locally adapted, resilient trees because they're epigenetically kind of adapted to our soils and climates. And our main game changer now is as well that we also seed the production trees. For example, we get a lot of the leftovers from juice production from small orchards, and we seed those seeds in our tree lines, and then after 2 years we go and graft them in the field. So we have a very genetically diverse base of the tree, and then our production variety grafted on top.
Very cool. Now, Dmitri, I know you don't have a nursery going just yet. What can you say about sourcing planting material, whether that be cuttings, trees in general, and trying to find the best quality in the area where you work?
Yeah, so I mean, what I was thinking about now, we had a nursery back in the days in Greece, and we were similar to Lorenz and Josh. We were planting most of our support species in them with root train systems, and it was and the productive species only the cuttings, because we would plant the trees and then they would grow, and then we just from the prunings we'd take some of the especially pomegranates and figs that are easy to reproduce that way. You don't need to be grafting, and that was just easy, and you buy them for like, I don't know, €3 a tree, but we would plant it for less, and it would be done by ourselves. It was definitely, let's say, especially for the support species, and based on the fact that they were in root trainers, it was really good. It helped us to plant a lot more trees out. It's just a knowledge thing. You need to first work out the system and work out how to do it, and then you on a few species that you want to do at scale, and maybe the others, like, buy them from somewhere, if you can get them from good quality. But going back to your initial question, my main concern is we can buy them from Spain, you know, they come from this region. Can't remember the name right now. It's they have a lot of forestry nurseries. Anyways, the point is that they come from quite far away, you know, and the seeds that they're using, I'm always concerned about how much we're losing by getting a species that's coming from another climate, you know, and different soil, and then we're planting it here and it's costing us only maybe 30 cents a tree. But still, like I'm not sure that's the most, it's hard to say how much we're losing. You know, we need to do trials and tests and to understand, like, okay, I've got a native, let's say a seed of the species that I got myself, and I'm planting it, and then I'm getting a tree from far away, seeing the difference, and then I want to do the same thing also with root trainer and no root trainer, and then I want to do the same with root trainer and seed. So there's so much like answer still. I mean, Lorenz is got some interesting experience there with the trees and the seeds, and I think that's a generally accepted thing. The only problem with that is that you need to be able to get the seed to germinate. I wanted to ask this question to Lorenz. I don't know, maybe we only have one more minute in the thing, but like, how do you get the seed to germinate and then to weed it effectively without, you know, that's, you know, without it being, you know, under lots of grass and having to go in there manually? I'm curious. But anyways, there's lots of questions out there, and definitely what my understanding and from the experience that we've had and from other people that I've heard and feedback that we generally receive is that these details they're not details, they make a big difference. So, I mean, if I were to be planting my agroforest systems with specific, like, let's say 4 or 5 species, I would definitely try to reproduce them myself here or work with a local nursery that would do it for me in the pots that I would want as well. But at the moment, we're not really there at that point in terms of the agroforestry we're doing on the farms where we're engaging in a regenerative transition. So I'm going to need to think a lot more about it, hopefully in the coming future.
Marvelous. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. There's a lot of takeaways from today's discussion. I know myself, I'm thinking, okay, in order to keep going with the nursery, tap into the waste streams and tap into the nerds. That's where you get all the good stuff. If anybody would like to follow along with this series, we have more panel discussions coming up every month. The next one will be on land access in Europe and around. And you can find all of the replays on the Climate Farmers YouTube channel and on the Regenerative Skills podcast, where this will be coming out next week. I want to thank all of our speakers again for coming and sharing their experience and their knowledge, and for everybody who attended and shared their questions and their ideas as well. I really look forward to seeing you all on the next series in this panel. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
You all have a good
Thank
night.
you.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.